Hi, everybody. I'm Terrence Arjun. I'm the manager of 192 Books, and we're here tonight to celebrate the publication of Nathan Kernan's A Day Like Any Other, The Life of James Schuyler. It's right here from FSG. I am going to skip a summary of the book because everybody should read it and buy it, and Nathan will sign it. So I'm going to jump into bios and tell you a little bit about the structure of the event. Nathan and Matthew will speak about the book and read from the book, and then Doug Crase, Eileen Myles, and Charles North will read their selections of Schuyler and talk about Schuyler, and then we'll have a Q&A, and then you'll all buy a book. So I'm going to jump into the bios. Nathan Kernan is a writer who lives in New York. He edited the Diary of James Schuyler, which was published by Black Sparrow Press in 1997, and is the author of the present volume. I added that in, sorry. Matthew Bevis is based at the English faculty in Oxford, where he runs a series of poetry initiatives. His essays have appeared in Harper's, the New York Review of Books, Poetry, Raritan, and the London Review of Books. He is currently finishing a book entitled Then Again, Notes on Lyric. Douglas Crase has been known for his poems in The Revisionist. Long out of print, they are available again in his collected poems, The Revisionist and the Astro-Pastorals. Today he's recognized likewise for his essays on poets, artists, and other cultural figures, some of them his intimate friends. His essays have been newly collected in a single volume on Autumn Lake. Eileen Myles is a poet, novelist, and art journalist whose practice of vernacular first-person writing has made them one of the most recognized writers of their generation. A Pathetic Literature, which they edited, came out in 2022, and their fiction includes Chelsea Girls, Cool for You, Inferno, and Afterglow. Writing on art was collected in the volume The Importance of Being Iceland, Travel Essays and Art. Books of poetry include I Must Be Living Twice, New and Selected Poems, Evolution, and A Working Life, and they live in New York and in Marfa, Texas. Charles North has published 12 poetry collections, among them Everything and Other Poems, a New York Times new and noteworthy book, and What It Is Like, which headed NPR's Best Poetry Books of the Year, and 3 books of essays. Other publications include collaborations with artist Trevor Winkfield and poet painter anthologies Broadway 1 and 2, co-edited with James Schuyler. Among his awards, 2 NEA fellowships, a Foundation for Contemporary Arts grant, 4 Fund for Poetry awards. Like all of our events, this is being streamed on YouTube and is going to be archived on the Paula Cooper Gallery studio website. And one final note is a thank you to Simon, who brought this book, Selected Art Writings of James Schuyler, which is also going to be for sale and is out of print and very hard to find. Almost as hard to find as Nathan's volume. So I'll pass it on to Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that okay? Can you hear? Yeah, good. Okay. It's a real pleasure and privilege for me to be here and to be talking with Nathan. There's a moment in this book. Nathan cites a letter from Schuyler to Anne Dunn in 1976, which I'll just quote from. He writes, "I'm all moved and happy to be a Chelseaite, embowered in friends." So I'm hoping that his spirit would feel suitably embowered again tonight. We're very grateful to 192 Books for hosting us and giving us all, whether Chelseaites or not, a really happy occasion. I first corresponded with Nathan a few years ago to thank him for his generosity. A student of mine at Oxford was writing her dissertation on Schuyler, and she had some questions, and I said, there's one person who will definitely know the answer to these quite tricky questions, and that's Nathan. And you were very generous in responding to her. And then I met him a few years ago at the centenary events in New York, and he was very kind and very supportive. So it's, as I said, a real pleasure to be here. I mean, anyone who loves Schuyler is dedicated and indebted to Nathan. First for the editing of the diaries, which I think came out in
97, yes.
97. And then now for this beautiful biography, which has been a labour of love over many years. And I think A Day Like Any Other is not simply a book that Schuyler's friends and fans have been waiting for. I think it's very likely to win him many new fans and many new friends and readers. It gives a wonderfully rich account of the ups and the downs in a rich life. And although Nathan does sort of quite modestly say at the beginning of the book, or near the beginning of the book, that it's not a critical biography, I also think it offers a very sort of richly suggestive... is that better? A richly suggestive set of ways that in which the life and the work might meet and part company or be read alongside each other. I think this is a sort of book in which anything might happen. Along the way, there are the enduring and formative presences, John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, Fairfield Porter, but there are also sort of quite surprising encounters along the way. Suddenly Tennessee Williams appears, or Lucian Freud. On any one day, Schuyler is to be found responding to many, many different things, mixings of the new and the old. One moment, he's just come home from seeing Waterfront, and then lying in bed discussing Keats's last letters. And so it takes in the many lives of Schuyler's writing, I think, not just the poetry, but we've also mentioned the beautiful art writings and the diaries. He was a wonderful letter writer, and much else beside. There's kind of a huge trove of unpublished material here, as well as many interviews with friends. Reading the book is a sort of dazzling experience, and not least I think for the way in which Nathan has managed to strike a balance between the great array and sometimes disarray of things going on in Schuyler's life, and a sense I think of coherence, or even concentredness in the life. If be permitted just to quote Schuyler's words, as I read, I did find myself thinking more than once, I can't get over how it all works in together. Ashbery on Schuyler, this is Ashbery's comment on Schuyler that was reprinted on the back of the collected poems, is that Schuyler is simply the best we have. And on the back of this book, Alex Katz rightly notes that Nathan Kernan's book is like being there. It's a supreme accomplishment. So please join me in just welcoming and thanking and celebrating our chance to be there and to be here with Nathan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you, 192 Books, and all of you for coming. This is a great moment for me.
Yeah. So are you happy to perhaps begin by maybe just reading a segment of
I'd be
the
happy
book,
to.
and then we'll have a few questions?
Sure.
Yeah, great. So do you want to set the scene for...
I thought I would read a section from the summer of 1953 when Jimmy was living. He was Frank O'Hara's roommate in New York on 49th Street, and he'd just begun a love affair with Arthur Gold, who was a part of half of the duo piano pair, Arthur Gold and Bobby Fisdale. Gold and Fisdale were living at that time in a Victorian house called the Ding Dong House in Sneeden's Landing, New York, on the other side of the Hudson River. So at the end of April 1953, Gold and Fisdale, with Arthur Weinstein, who was Fisdale's lover, again took up residence in the Ding Dong House. Jimmy spent as much time there as he could that spring and summer, and he remembered it as a particularly happy period. For a while, he became a commuter, working at the bookstore where he had a job in the city. Is this okay? During the day, and driving back and forth with a neighbor or taking the bus to Sneeden's and staying out there on his vacation and days off. The Ding Dong house was furnished in a casual way with hand-me-downs and antiques, including a pair of pier glasses in carved gold frames that faced each other at opposite ends of the living room, multiplying the light and everyone's reflections. The room also contained 2 grand pianos where Gold and Fizdale practiced for several hours a day. This could be too much of a good thing, and Jimmy would retreat to the other end of the house to write while they were practicing. Even there, he could still hear the thunder of the 2 pianos. The Gold and Fizdale social circle consisted of a stellar group of fellow musicians, performers, and artists. Dropping in for a meal or staying the weekend might be the composers Aaron Copland, Samuel Barber, Giancarlo Menotti, Leonard Bernstein, Virgil Thompson, or Ned Rorem. Choreographers Jerome Robbins and George Balanchine and his wife, the dancer Tanaquil Leclerc, actress Ina Claire, singers Lottie Lenya and Tova Frisch, and many others. Jimmy was a quiet presence, as always, and wasn't included all that much in the conversations. This didn't bother him, however, as he loved listening to the urbane talk, and he helped with the cooking. Frank O'Hara came out for one memorable weekend, and a group decided to drive out to Coney Island for the day. Jimmy was scared and miserable on the famous roller coaster, but Frank typically was exhilarated by it. Driving back, Frank was still somewhat punch-drunk from the park and sped up as he came into the driveway, pretending he was about to run into Fizdale and several others standing there, but stopped just in time. Fizdale and Gold were frightened and angry at this recklessness, and Jimmy assumed that this would be the last time Frank would be invited out to Sneeden's Landing. On the contrary, at breakfast the next morning, Fizdale sidled up to Schuyler and said, "I very much like your friend Frank O'Hara." Later that day, when Jimmy walked into Fizdale's bathroom, he was surprised to find Bobby and Frank in the tub, happily taking a bath together. For the rest of the summer, to Jimmy's great delight, Arthur Weinstein was off the scene, and O'Hara and Fizdale enjoyed what would turn out to be a summer romance. There was a witty symmetry to the arrangement, noted with amusement at the time, the 2 poet roommates having simultaneous affairs with the 2 duo piano partners. The tandem love affairs had the incidental effect of bringing Jimmy and Frank closer together, emphasizing a sort of brotherly feeling that they seemed to have shared, particularly around this time. Jane Freilacher and her husband, Joe Hazen, the painter Jane Freilacher and her husband Joe Hazen, were renting a house in nearby Nyack that summer, and there was much coming and going between the 2 houses, including one weekend when Fairfield and Ann Porter were visiting Jane and Joe. This was Jimmy's 3rd meeting with Fairfield, who surprised him again with his unself-conscious behavior when he saw the artist reading casually while lying on the bare flagstone terrace. Quote, "I didn't know Fairfield at all well at that point. I didn't realize that simply lying on the ground or rug or a floor or a stone or beach was utterly natural to him." Close quote. The pianists had been given the use of a swimming pool belonging to some neighbors, whose house opened onto a stone terrace directly above the edge of the Palisades. Standing there, one had the sensation of being up among the treetops, looking over and through very old and ancient trees to the river and the far shore, a setting that gave Frank the idea for his play, The Houses at Falling Hanging. One evening after a visit to Nyack, they all drove back to Sneeden's Landing and to the neighbor's house with the pool, where they took off their clothes and went swimming in the moonlight. Jimmy later recalled that idyllic summer evening and, quote, "How ravishing Jane looked, naked in the moonlight, with her rather large breasts slipping into the water. Frank dove and dove and dove. There's no way to describe what a marvelous swimmer he was. Small pool, deep and turbulent ocean. Frank was always ready for it." Close quote. Frank's grace and confidence extended to other areas of his life, such as dancing at parties and driving. To Jimmy, he was the most brilliant driver I've ever known, completely confident, completely relaxed, completely in control, smooth, rather speedy, but he never drove too fast. Jimmy now decided that he ought to learn to drive himself. He took out a learner's permit and started taking occasional lessons from Fizdale, but they were both too nervous and the lessons were not a success. Then Frank took over and suddenly it was all magic. Frank's skill and confidence behind the wheel became infused in his pupil, and Jimmy happily drove O'Hara all around the neighborhood of Sneeden's Landing. Franz Lehar's operetta The Merry Widow was playing on the car radio as they returned to the house one day, and for some reason this suddenly seemed terribly funny, and they broke into gales of infectious laughter. At the end of the summer, Gold and Fizdale departed for their usual fall and winter tour in Europe. It was a blustery, overcast day when the poets drove the two pianists to the airport and then returned to the empty house where they found the maid closing up. She had always seemed slightly hostile to Jimmy and Frank before, but now she became warm and rather tearful as their presence, quote, reminded her of friends, a house that always means music, swimming at night, plays, poems, love, and quarrels, close quote. The two poets hitchhiked back to the city while reminiscing about the past few months and their friends. Grace Hardigan and her natural generosity, and the beaux yeux of Jane Freilacher. When they got home, they wrote poems and letters to their respective lovers before going out to an opening at Tibor de Nage Gallery and on to the San Remo bar. The rest of the autumn of 1953 was a bit of a letdown, at least in Jimmy's memory. One day, Stuart Preston, the art critic for the New York Times, called to invite him and Frank to a Halloween party. They went to a thrift store and bought long black mourning veils and hats and proceeded to the party on their Upper East Side, where they put on their veils in the vestibule. Preston answered the door, kilted and in full Highland regalia, and all of the other guests were also dressed very elaborately, quote, like Pierrots and that kind of thing. The effect that we had on them was stunning. We filled them with loathing and hate. I was drinking a martini under my veil when I turned to Frank and said, "Get me out of here." Close quote. They then went downtown to a big loft party where the only other person in drag was the poet James Merrill, wearing his maid's dress and some sort of schmata wrapped around his head, who exclaimed, "My dears, I'm so glad to see you." Quote, "The evening for me ended in snow," Jimmy later reminisced, and going home with someone in lederhosen who was rather fun. When I left his house, I left my veil and hat on the hood of a car.
Thank you. Yeah, actually that passage can lead to a first question maybe, because it gives, one of the things the biography does, to give a huge, sort of a capacious sense of connectedness and the milieu, friends, lovers, and so on. But there's also this other side of it, which was hinted at there, that Jimmy's quietness and sometimes separateness and silences. And when you were writing it, did you feel either a tension or as the biography got made, between sort of getting these, sort of putting him in the social and finding another way also to talk about him?
Yes, I mean, he was a quiet, shy person. So I would often ask people, "What do you remember about James Schuyler?" And they'd say, "Well, not much. He sat in the corner and he would be very quiet, not like Frank O'Hara, who was always out there emoting. So that was something I tried to express, that he was a quiet person, and he sort of tried to reflect a little bit about him through other people. That I tried to make it almost I wouldn't say a group biography, but to try to explain that he was part of a group, and he felt that, and you sort of bounce all these people against each other, and maybe you find Jimmy in the middle.
Another thought I had was just in relation to obviously the title, and which comes from February, and I wondered I was going to say most biographies take shape chronologically for all the obvious reasons, and there is a kind of dailiness and a day-to-dayness that needs to be recorded. Closer, sorry. But alongside that, there's also a sense in the book of associativeness that isn't chronological. Sometimes, especially when you're talking about the poems, there's a moment where you're talking about crystal lithium, and you talk about the kind of the different fragments of his experience, literary and non-literary, that go into the making of that. I'm thinking there's a moment where you suggest the poem happens everywhere and in every time at once. So I was wondering, is that another kind of thing that you were thinking as you were writing, when to move away from chronological day after dayness into some other kind of register? Was that?
I guess so, yeah. I wanted to simply say what happened. And Jimmy loved diaries, he loved letters, he loved newspapers.
Yeah.
And it was important to just try to be clear about a chronology. I started this project by compiling a chronology for the diary. But yes, of course, in that poem and in many of them, especially the morning of the poem, he is everywhere at once. And I toyed with various ideas, sort of postmodern ideas about doing the biography in a series of themes or something like that. But I obviously didn't want to do that in the end.
There's also the sense in which you talk about how certain family groups, I think, is it when you're talking about the Porters, it echoes back to certain patterns that you notice in the Maoris. Is that
was a theme? Certainly, his yearning for a stable family after his own had been broken up as a child. He was always, it seemed to me, searching for a group, a family. The way we all kind of do. We form our own families when we grow up. If we grow up.
If we grow up. What maybe one last question, then we'll move to the poets. I think, even while there's a moment in the book early on where you talk about, I'll just read it actually. You say, even while absorbing the details of Schuyler's life, I would have the reader remember the caveat that Schuyler himself sets out in Hymn to Life about the taxonomy of his beloved roses. And then the quote, after learning all their names, Rose de Recht, Cornelia, Pax, it is important to forget them. And I just wanted, if this isn't too tricky a question, just questions about what you felt needed to be left out or forgotten, or was it a hard job sort of trimming this biography, or just given the amount, clearly this is decades of work, and so I wondered, what to I'm not asking you for a list of omissions, but just a sense of
the book was about twice as long originally at one point, and
wow.
I actually hired somebody to help me cut it down. When my editor Jonathan Galassi saw the pile of manuscript, he kind of threw up his hands, and so there was a lot, but it needed to be a shorter book. We'd always wanted it to be a short book. Not that this is short; it's longer than we'd originally envisioned. I think it's the right length. But I was trying to be I guess I believe that. I was trying to point in that phrase. I was trying to point readers back to the poems, really,
Yeah.
and not to get bogged down in how it might relate to his life. But at the same time, that fascinates me. So I was being a little bit trying to say two things at the same time.
Yeah, I think that
guess.
comes across. There's a sense that you do feel that as you read that the poetry takes its bearings from the life, but you also don't feel that the poems are symptomatic, should we say, of certain things in the life. Sometimes they're a reimagining or a different kind of life.
Yeah, he put his life into his poems in a sense.
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah. Thank you. Should we move to? Is there an order, a running order?
I assume alphabetical.
Okay, let's go. Are you happy with that, Doug?
How's that? Good for good? One thing I always remember about Jimmy is his sense of timing. His timing was almost impeccable. The poems, if you think about them, are built of little shocks and aftershocks. And it's true, but by the way, it's wonderful that the art writings are here, because not only are the poems built of little shocks and aftershocks, but the art writings are too. I'm a great fan of these, and if you've not read them, take a look. They're some of them quite astonishing. Thank you. In poetry, all these little shocks and aftershocks meant that he could reproduce or produce what he once called the coming and going of life, although he said it in French. I can't do that. No matter how messy the situation was, and I think we've probably heard about some messy situations already, and there are a lot of them in Nathan's book. So I thought, in the spirit of Nathan's biography, which is fearless, that I should be fearless also tonight, and reveal one of the messy backstories that Jimmy turned into a beautiful poem. And the poem is Growing Dark. We were all out at Bob Dash's place in Sagaponack, which had two houses, a winter house and a summer house. And because it was late in the season, all the drinking and the socializing and eating and more drinking took place in the winter house. But it was still warm enough that some of us could sleep in the summer house. Jimmy had one bedroom there, and Frank and I had the other. If you know us, it probably seems like Frank and I have been together forever. We have. But at this time, the affair was all shivery and new. In fact, there was an original sin behind the affair. I had to betray someone else in order to have the affair. It was the worst thing I'd ever done, and I was so miserable about it that I went in private to Bob, and I asked him, I said, what if I just went back to the lover I betrayed and pretended nothing had ever happened? Like, would that work? And what I wasn't counting on was that Bob, for whatever reason, could not wait to get Frank aside when I wasn't around to tell him that I was leaving him. This was news to Frank. It would have been news to me, too, if I'd heard it that way. And Frank slunk off to the summer house without my knowing anything about what was going on, where Jimmy had also retired early to go to bed. And I had no idea what was going on until I read Jimmy's poem, Growing Dark. And this is Growing Dark by James Schuyler. The grass shakes, smoke streaks, no, cloud strokes. The dogs are fed. Their licenses clank on pottery. The phone rings and is answered. The pond path is washed out grass between green winter cover. Last night in bed I read. You came to my room and said, "Isn't the world terrible?" "My dear," I said, "it could be and has been worse. So beautiful, and things keep getting in between. When I was young, I hurt others. Now, others have hurt me. In the night, I thought I heard a dog bark. Racking sobs. Poor guy. Yet I got my sleep. Well, if you're me, you can see why this poem is indelible. I mean, thought I heard a dog bark, but it was racking sobs, my Frank. And in the middle, there's that beautiful summary, like, of Jimmy's whole project. So beautiful, and things keep getting in between. And if you think about that, the framework, the constant in that framework is not the things in between, it's the so beautiful on either side, as if his instinct was always to treat the interruptions as incidental, and the so beautiful as the thing that endures. And just to underline that, I want to close with Jimmy's own words, which turned up just recently in the annual report of the Whiting Writers Awards. In this report, there's an introduction by the novelist Howard Norman. He got a Whiting Award the same year Jimmy did. He was like 36 and Jimmy was 62. And he writes in his introduction how much it meant to him to be on the platform as a young writer with James Schuyler. On the evening of the award ceremony, I was seated behind James Schuyler. At one point, in rumpled sports jacket and trousers, and with a tone that contained as much admonition as offhanded sage wisdom, he turned and said, "Look at me, at my age, getting a prize like this. Well, all any of us can do is stay the course."
There, I think, right? Yeah, it's so funny. When we were shooting emails to each other about what we were going to do tonight, I was like, oh, I'll read that poem that ends with "a day like any other," like completely forgetting it was the title of the book. But it is, February, it is a poem that, just for years, whenever I've taught poetry in workshops, I've used this poem because it's sort of easy and perfect and then utterly complicated. I wish there was a I used to even bring in there's a samba, a bossa nova song that it's in Brazilian, but it's just an incantation and a list of things, and it has a way, and it really bears a resemblance to this because in a way this is just such a song. It's just this procession of things that somehow winds up so miraculous. So I just wanted to read it, and then I have a few thoughts around it and about it. But to hear it first, so here's February. A chimney breathing a little smoke, the sun I can't see, making a bit of pink. I can't quite see in the blue. The pink of 5 tulips at 5 p.m. on the day before March 1st. The green of the tulip stems and leaves, like something I can't remember, finding a jack in the pulpit a long time ago and far away. Why, it was December then, and the sun was on the sea, by the temples we'd gone to see. One green wave moved in the violet sea, like the UN building on big evenings, green and wet, while the sky turns violet. A few almond trees had a few flowers, like a few snowflakes, out of the blue looking pink in the light. A gray hush in which the boxy trucks roll up 2nd Avenue into the sky. They're just going over the hill. The green leaves of the tulips on my desk, like grass light on flesh, and a green copper steeple and streaks of cloud beginning to glow. I can't get over how it all works in together, like a woman who just came to her window and stands there filling it, jogging her baby in her arms. She's so far off. Is it the light that makes the baby pink? I can see the little fists and the rocking horse motion of her breasts. It's getting grayer and cold and gold and chilly. 2 dog-sized lions face each other at the corners of a roof. It's the yellow dust inside the tulips. It's the shape of a tulip. It's the water in the drinking glass the tulips are in. It's a day like any other. And you kind of begin at the end in the way, because it's sort of like the samba part for me is it's the yellow dust inside the tulips. It's the shape. It's just like the ecstasy is building and building, and then he kind of bitch slaps it. It's a day like any other. And it's this incredible tone that is pure Schuyler, which is to celebrate and dismiss at once, and then kind of normalize. And it's kind of a feat that almost nobody does accomplish it like him. I mean, I think this thing that's specific about a poet is that we all have these tones, and Jimmy's tone is like no other. And it was weird. Yesterday I was in Cambridge because there's a John Wiener's book that just got reissued, Behind the State Capitol, and it's kind of a mad book, and there's just all these beautiful nuggets in it. And I found something, and also actually it was funny. Somebody read a letter that was it Frank wrote to Kenneth Koch about him and Jimmy meeting this young poet in Boston, John Wiener's, and he's kind of interesting. We ought to help him get published. And it was so cool, this endless relay and association of all these people knowing each other at the same time. But I found this in the midst of of this book-length poem, or many poems of John Wiener's, and he says, "There is a condition of mankind dependent on hallucinations in place of imagination." And I feel so puzzled and glorified by that line, because I think it does suggest this way exactly I think what's happening in this poem is this an imagination or a hallucination, and they always kind of they keep replacing each other in a way, and I think that's the fascination of the poem. And also I've been reading, there's a Czech philosopher that I've been very excited about, a guy named Willem Flusser. I'm not sure if any of you guys know him, and he wrote an amazing book called I think it's the end, Post History, and he's talking about how when before there was at the point at which text was invented, it was because there were too many images, and there was this glut of images that was producing a hallucinatory quality in human beings. And you can even go back to the Middle Ages and think of Joan of Arc and the moment when there were all these saints and mad, crazy people having visions. And part of it was they were illiterate, and there were so many images, and there were so many changes going on in society at once, and nobody knew how to organize it, and language kind of came in and did the trick and kind of saved humanity from its own insanity. But I guess part of the reason I bring this up is that I feel like that's part of the trick of every poet, and particularly this poet too, which is to say all these ages of man, because later there was something that happened when, and then electronic images came in and saved text from itself and so on, and there's a whole theory to this. But it's just like, there are these great ages in humanity, and I think there are these great ages within a person that creates art, and it's like having these same struggles and these same compensations. And I think Jimmy is this struggle between text and hallucination, and it's like it's so fucking ordinary except that it's so almost mad, and it's just and because it starts with all these, the sun I can't see, I can't quite see in the blue, something I can't remember. All this, like, that begins with this kind of like stating and then blurring. It's like this inability, which creates this kind of vulnerability and openness to what comes next. And then he does this a long time ago and far away, like fairy tale, like very simple language and language of childhood. And then all these like repetitions. The sun was on the sea by the temples we'd gone to see. One green wave moved in on the violet sea. And it reminds me of, years ago, I think Peter, Paul, and Mary were explaining folk songs in some record. And they said, well, it's sort of like a lot of redundancy so the child feels safe, And I feel like that's exactly what these kind of ultra simple rhymes, which are just repetitions, and then it's like, while the sky turns violet, and part of me, that's in a way that's one of the crazy things that happens, like as we observe like nature. It's like, is that natural? That the sky becomes violet, and it is, but that stream. I mean, the part of the ecstasy every day of dawn and dusk is that there's these weird color shifts that some part of us can't comprehend, and it's exciting and crazy. And then he does the same thing with a few almond trees, had a few flowers and a few snowflakes. But then here's the crazy part, in which the boxy trucks roll up 2nd Avenue into the sky. Hallucination, again, it's sort of like, it's the visual thing that we see and we're watching it, it's ordinary and we're tripping out, and then again, he undoes it. He goes, they're just going over the hill, so it's like, no, don't get all excited, and then there's so much longing in here, like the green leaves of the tulips on my desk, like grass light on flesh in a green copper steeple. And this is just a feeling, and I think you get this when you read a poem many times and you know it, and you start to have feelings about it, and it starts to become like your own memories, because I feel like that's particular grass light on flesh, and that's a particular green copper. I feel like that's a memory of lovers in the grass somewhere. I think it saturates the poem with this feeling. And then we get like a woman who just came to her window and stands there filling it. And it's two things. It's a screen, it's completely like a movie. And also she's a deity, it's sort of like she's not, it's like any woman, but she's kind of a goddess. And then it goes, jogging her baby in her arms, she's so far off. And this is where is she? I mean, it's like there's a window right over there. Can he see the details of it? Because then he goes, that makes the baby pink. I can see the little fists and the rocking horse motion of her breast. Can he see that? And so it's just like, again, it's like the fictionalizing and the speculative. And are we close or are we far? And again, I think he's playing with focus and very filmic. We get the two dog-sized lions face each other like guards, making it safe. And then it's just like, and then we go into the last three or four lines, and suddenly it was just like, it's the yellow dust inside the tulips. It's interior. It's like suddenly we go into a deep, radical close-up. And I think that, again, that's part of the magical procession of this poet's work, is that we're in one level of ordinary, and then we're in an extraordinary level of ordinary, which is this kind of sweet interior that again, film could reproduce, but it's like the incredibleness of poetry is it goes like that. It can do it so quick and fast. And then he goes, it's the shape of the tulip. And we know what it is about tulips is this weird shape they have, and it's like interior, exterior. And then, it's the water in the drinking glass the tulips are in. And then it's just where I began. It's a day like any other. It's like pushing everything off the desk and clatter, and the poem's done. And I think, again, if you read a lot of Schuyler's poems, what you'll find again and again is this, it's so ordinary, and it's like this countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7, it's like something taking off, and sometimes it goes higher, and that's what he means to do, and other times he gets so high that I think he gets scared, and it was just like, no, it's okay, it's just a day like any other, and suddenly we're just here, having seen the marvelous and then being returned to the ordinary, which is our bodies and all our sensations. So that's all I got.
Big Evenings is one of my favorite phrases, by the way. The UN building on Big Evenings. And it's one of my favorite poems, too, and I taught it for 25 years. Every single poetry class I ever taught, I taught that poem in it for all kinds of reasons, including your wonderful delineation of so many of them. I'm only going to be about 5 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about my connections with Jimmy and end up by reading two tiny diary entries and one poem which is also one of my favorites. I didn't bring your book because I wanted the one that was coffee stained, which would prove that it's been my favorite for years and years. Okay. So this is probably only about 5 minutes. I'm really happy to be here, by the way, as I think everybody else is, to celebrate the publication of this long-awaited book, to say the least, which I don't know if you would agree, but to me is exciting in the same way Jimmy's long-awaited first poetry reading was at the age of 65. People forget 65 years old, right? Before he gave his first reading, and everybody who was there was just knocked out. I didn't know Jimmy nearly as well as did his close friends, or his, quote, assistants, as he called them, like Eileen, among other things, who spent time with him every day at the Chelsea Hotel, attending to daily chores and the like. But he was my first poetry hero, and he remained my chief inspirer for all kinds of reasons. In the 1970s, my wife, Paula, and I had him to dinner pretty regularly. We weren't alone. He had dinner with the painter George Schneeman and his wife, Katie, fairly often as well, having to do, I think, with what you were talking about, craving family life and so on. It seemed to mean a great deal to him. I wrote, Jimmy loved and missed family life, and being with us, first alone, then with our infant daughter, to some degree made up for that. And during the short time in the late 70s, when he lived very close to me, actually, to us, at the Lincoln Square Home for Adults on Broadway, I visited fairly often, mostly as myself. Twice I was addressed as Mr. Park, which is Dara Park. I don't think he got many visitors up there, but you'd think that there were few enough so that they could keep them straight. Anyway, it was very nice having Jimmy at the apartment. He was mostly quiet, but never without wit, and I always got a kick out of his slow chuckle. In the winter, he used to send me downstairs for a quart of eggnog, which he would finish with dinner and sometimes before. I remember his having quite long, matted hair and wearing a big, ratty sheepskin jacket, and describing himself as looking like Buffalo Bill's grandmother. Brilliant. Why didn't he put it in a poem? He slept over once or twice, too, on a couch in our living room. I'm not positive, but I think it was, Terence mentioned the sort of the two magazine anthologies that we edited together called Broadway, Poets and Painters. I'm not positive, but I think it was during a Lincoln Square home visit that we got to talking about his one-shot magazine, 49 South, named for Fairfield and Ann Porter's address in Southampton. Completely unfancy, the magazine was notable for including artwork as well as poems by some of the best poets and artists around. We decided to do a follow-up along the same lines, titling it Broadway, a Poets and Painters Anthology, and wound up doing a sequel a decade later. We invited, I think, 60 or 70 poets and artists to, quote, send us your best unpublished poem or drawing, which wording Jimmy got a great kick out of. Me too, since the invitations were going to the likes of John Ashbery, Robert Creeley, Allen Ginsberg, Barbara Guest, Kenneth Koch, J.H. Prynne, Mary Abbott, Nell Blaine, Rudy Burkhart, Jane Freilicher, Yvonne Jacquet, and Alex Katz. Send us your best work. Along I remember that slow chuckle there too. Along with many of the best younger poets and artists around, including Eileen and Doug. And among the artists, Joe Brainerd, Rackstar Downs, Trevor Wingfield. A quick P.S. to that. In the book, Nathan mentions my surprise that easygoing Jimmy, bridled at a few of the poets I originally proposed for our anthologies. Nathan asked me which ones, but fortunately I couldn't remember. I do remember that Jimmy gave in on a few, but by no means all. As we all know, it isn't only Jimmy's poems that are extraordinary. There are his diaries, his fiction, his art writing, his letters, and more. So I'm going to read two tiny entries from diaries, along with a short poem. I fell in love with the diaries about 15 years before Nathan's big edition came out, when Jeff Young's press The Figures published a tiny chapbook entitled Early in 1971. Tiny. I haven't had the book in my pocket every minute since then, a la Frank O'Hara and the poems of Pierre Reverdy, but it's remained one of my literary treasures, coffee stains and all. I love every word. I love every word in February too, by the way, and every phrase, and it's so surprisingly brilliant in so many places. Exactly what you were talking about with the ordinary and the extraordinary. It looks ordinary, and I think the ordinary why am I interrupting myself? Stop. No, I think the as it were, let's say, ordinary language is part of the reason it's such a wonderful poem, because he can be exact and precise and gorgeous and associative in the most interesting ways, and still somehow speak naturally. And yet it's extraordinary. It's an amazing poem. What a model, too, for poets. Just unbelievable. Anyway, as I wrote about the diaries, I love every word. So these are two poem passages, really tiny, chosen pretty much at random. It's really a tiny book. January 2nd, Southampton. 7:30 in the morning, and the sun makes golden pink patches on the shadowy white snow. And as I try to find a way to express the clarity, the softness, the visual quiet of the morning sky, there comes a clatter and a crash of plastic dishes from the laundry below this room, and I go to break up a cat fight. I'm prejudiced against Hodge, the aggressor, rather than his sister Danny Rex, the provoker, not because of favoring the underdog cat, but because of the grating voice he inherited from some Siamese ancestor, no doubt by way of his father, who was certainly Tuxie, the black and white killer cat who used to live next door. Right this moment, the white snow is in fact as blue as the sky, which is very pale, the difference only that between transparent watercolor and opaque watercolor. And the privet hedge lights up like a once gilt iron grill, with bits of fluff and dust and here and there a rag caught in it. Others in the house are up, for there goes Bruno dashing madly around in the snow, and now barks to be let in. Others too are up. In an interval of a tall spruce, a flag flaps its red and white striped wings. This is much shorter. February 22nd. Creepily misty morning. Dank, dark, disheveled, and rather ominous, like a destroyer just gone into dry dock. But how beautiful it was at the first light to hear the repetitious song of a cardinal. My pleasure in it is more than just that I can recognize it. It's not unlike that which someone who doesn't know music takes in the songs he does know. Simple and right from the heart to the heart, or perhaps from the throat to the ear is enough, but in that way in which hearing is itself suddenly a kind of singing. This poem is called December 28, 1974. It's one of my favorites of Jimmy's. I have a lot of favorites. And it was unaccountably, I think, left out of the first selected. Amazing to me. So, December 28, 1974. The plants against the light which shines in, it's 4 o'clock, right on my chair. I'm in my chair. Are silhouettes, barely green, growing black as my eyes move right to where the sun is. I am blinded by a fiery circle. I can't see what I write. A man comes down iron stairs, I don't look up, and picks up brushes which against the sonata of Scriabin's rattle like wind in a bamboo clump. A wooden sound and purposeful footsteps softened by a drop cloth covered floor. To be incubed in flaming splendor. There's no stanza break, by the way. I think that's important. To be incubed in flaming splendor, 1 foot on a Chinese rug, while the mad emotive music tears at my heart. Rip it open. I want to cleanse it in an icy wind. And what kind of tripe is that? Still, last night I did wish. No, that's my business, and I don't wish it now. Your poems, a clunkhead said, have grown more open. I don't want to be open, merely to say, to see and say things as they are. That at my elbow there's a wicker table. Hortus second, says a book. The fields beyond the feeding sparrows are brown, palely brown, yet with an inward glow, like that of someone of a frank good nature whom you trust. I want to hear the music hanging in the air and drink my Coca-Cola. The sun is off me now. The sky begins to color up. The air in here is filled with wildly flying notes. Yes, the sun moves off to the right and prepares to sink, setting beyond the dunes, an ocean on fire. Thanks.
Thank you, all three of you, for wonderful, wonderful readings and reminiscences and thoughts. So we have a little time for questions. 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, yeah. So the floor is the audience's and Nathan's. Yeah.
I love the long title poems, like in Morning of the Poem, that are at the end of the book. I think it's in like 3 of them or something.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me anything about them, what he thought about them, or is that a novel idea, putting a very long poem, the title one at the end?
Yeah, I don't know. He I think it's interesting that he did organize his books in sections by location. You know, Southampton, Vermont, and then he love poems in several of them, and then yes, the long poems that he wrote did end the respective books that they were in. I just think it made sense in a sort of dramatic way, perhaps, to do it that way.
How did Jimmy come into your life? Why?
Well, I was working in an art gallery in the 80s, and I sort of was part of some of at the fringes of some of his milieu a little bit, and I loved his work. I came to love his work in the mid 80s and went to the reading the famous deer reading, and I had two friends who knew him well and made it their business to introduce me. One of them was the painter Ann Dunn, whose husband, Rodrigo Moynihan, was shown at the gallery I worked for, the Robert Miller Gallery, and the other one was my friend Joe Brainerd. And within short time, they both invited me to dinner with Jimmy, and sort of it took off from there, especially the dinner with Joe, because Joe had been such a good friend of, but they both were such good friends of Schuyler. And then, so we became quite good. This was late in his life. It was the last year of his life, but we were quite close in that time. And we saw one another about once a week, I would say, for dinner or something like that. And then, he suddenly died, which was just such a shock. Somehow I got it into my head that I wanted to write the biography. I don't know how. I guess because we sort of shared a taste in certain kind of literature, maybe. And so I approached his executor, Dara Park, who was also a friend, the painter, Dara Park, and he said, well, no, I'm not ready to assign the biography to anyone right now, but would you be interested in editing the diary? And I, of course, said that would be great. I'd love to do that. And so that's and while I edited the diary, I also compiled a chronology of Schuyler's life to put at the end. And that allowed me to begin conducting interviews with people, which I later used in the biography. Yes?
I don't remember where, but in one of his poems, he refers to himself as having Upper East Side Queen taste. And I would love to know what about, how wide was his literary taste? Because there's also a quote from Edmund White saying that he's the only American poet he knew of who managed to get something of the Chinese feel for nature into his poetry.
When he was talking about Upper East Side Queen, that was in a gay bar, and it was about music. The music that was playing on the jukebox, the Noel Coward song. What is it? Anyway, I can't remember. Mad About the Boy. Thank you. Yes. But in his taste in literature was very, very broad. As John Ashbery said, he read everything. He read obscure early American novel, like novelists, and he loved letters and diaries and English diarists, novelists, 20th century, 18th century. He was a voracious reader, really. So his literary knowledge was very broad, much broader than that quote might give you make you think.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to Eileen Myles' perception of his poems, and it never. I read the selected poems years ago, so I'm looking forward to rereading them with her take on them. But I'm wondering this idea of the fantastical, that is in addition to his citing the natural world, the everyday.
Well, when I knew him at the end of his life, he was stable. I didn't get a sense of his having hallucinations or anything like that when I knew him. But Eileen went through some tough periods with him when he was psychotic and described Eileen when I interviewed them had told me about a time when Jimmy was in his room writing, and he was sort of bursting. He was red in the face and looked like he was bursting and very in distress. But then when they looked at the poem that he'd been writing, it was full of what Eileen called these calm domestic beauties. So he was creating the world that he needed out of pain and out of psychosis, I guess. But when I knew him, no, he wasn't that way. Eileen, do you want to say something too?
I feel like those of us who knew him well, it was like, then the same way that you know anybody well, you start to feel their feelings. And so sometimes you could feel a storm coming. You know, I mean, I remember Tom and I remember having a distinct feeling, even towards the end of his life, that there may have been another breakdown coming, because there was just an intensity that you could, so it was just like it was weather. It felt like weather,
Yes.
Jimmy's sensibility, and that was really important. But the other thing I was thinking about, related to what you were saying in the book, is his quietude, and that one would always remark upon that's who he was in the room, the quiet guy sitting there. And then when we look at these poems and we listen to them, and he's having a complete, full-on social engagement with the universe, with all of nature, like it's sort of the chattiness. It was in the same way that you could feel the weather inside of him. It's like it's a compressed dialogue with everything. And I think that's the very nature of the poems, and whether that's sanity or madness, who knows? But he was like a miniaturist of a very big conversation, like almost like a deity in a way.
Yeah.
Should we take one more question? We have one.
Guess not.
Ah.
I don't know if that. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I've lived in New York for a long time myself, so I sort of hear. I love the fact that Jimmy said in a letter, in a postcard to Tom Carey, enclosing a little picture of 1940s New York, that he said that New York in the 40s was my New York. So I try to imagine New York in the 40s. I kind of see it in black and white somehow, and it's this yeah, right. Yeah, I guess I a little bit see it through his eyes more than I used to. Yeah. And his from his eyrie at the Chelsea Hotel, looking out, I always think of him when I walk by there. And he loved the texture of the city. I remember him showing me an inscribed block of stone at the base of a house that had an apartment building that you live in, Doug, which was formerly the site of the house of Clement Clark Moore, the author of The Night Before Christmas. He had these little, and also showing me the Whispering Gallery in Grand Central, which I think he said Chester had shown him. Chester Coleman. Yeah.
Thank you for thank you to everyone for being involved for an incredible evening, and most importantly, thank you to Nathan for this gift of a book.
Thank you all.